Hi, everybody. Welcome back to day 2 of the 2020 International eConference on Religion and the Holocaust. I'm Dr. Darren Slade. I'm president of the Global Center for Religious Research. And I want to say thank you guys for attending today. What's magnificent about these types of events is that you get to be joined with academics and scholars and students from all over the world. All 7 continents have joined us this weekend to hear the latest research in Holocaust studies. You get to actually hear scholars, some of the foremost international scholars in philosophy and history and Jewish studies, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. So it's one of the incredible things we do at GCRR. And today I have the incredible privilege of introducing our next guest, Dr. Morgan Rempel. And allow me to share my screen to give a proper introduction. Dr. Rempel today is going to be speaking about Primo Levi on belief, non-belief, and becoming a Jew. Now, he has got his PhD from the University of Toronto and is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Georgia Southern University in Savannah. Quite the change from being in Canada to the deep south of the United States. Now, he has published numerous academic articles in numerous publications on ancient philosophy, ancient religion, continental philosophy, the philosophy of religion, philosophy and film, and of course, Holocaust studies. Now, one of his more recent publications, book publications that I want to highlight is this one here entitled Nietzsche, Psychohistory and the Birth of Christianity. Now, many of you probably already know that Nietzsche himself was a fan of Jesus and his message, or at least he respected Jesus and his message. But Nietzsche was also very antagonistic to other key figures like St. Paul and other key figures of the ancient church. So what Dr. Rempel does in this volume is he basically systematizes the rationale, the origins and rationale for Nietzsche's antagonism toward the early church. If you guys ever get a chance to take a look at this, I highly recommend this book. It is a fantastic study in both Nietzschean philosophy and historical church studies. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend, Dr. Rempel. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Professor Slade. I'll just assume you can hear me and see me just fine. So I'm going to talk to you today about Primo Levi on belief, non-belief, and becoming a Jew. I teach a course on the Holocaust, and I use Primo Levi's most famous book, Survival in Auschwitz, in my course. If you haven't read this book, you will never forget it. It's wonderful. Anyway, my talk today, I'm going to divide it into 4 sections. First, I'm going to talk about Primo Levi's childhood and his youth, particularly his sense of being a Jew. Then I'm going to talk about his arrest and his imprisonment at the Auschwitz camp in Poland. In the 3rd section of my paper, I'm going to talk about his last book, which is called The Drowned and the Saved, which he wrote 40 years after his camp experience, where he reflects on some of these same stories. And in the final section of my paper, I'm going to look at the effect of his imprisonment and the anti-Semitism he experienced on his self-conception as a Jew. So that's going to be that's going to be the format of my talk today. So here's a brief biography of Levi with a focus on his Jewish identity. So he's born in 1919 in Turin, Italy, and being from Italy sets Levi apart from most Holocaust writers. Most Jewish victims and most survivors of the Holocaust were from Eastern Europe. So the fact that Levi's voice is from Italy sets him apart from other survivors. And he notes several times in his writing that the fact that his first language was Italian and that he does not speak Yiddish put him at a disadvantage at Auschwitz. So Levi's ancestors immigrated to Italy centuries earlier to escape the Spanish Inquisition. His mother's side of the family was more religious than his father's side, but in a nutshell, Levi's family were middle class, liberal, secular, thoroughly integrated Jews. Levi describes himself as an assimilated Jew or a secular Jew. That's his self-conception. Levi biographer Ian Thompson notes that while most of the important Jewish festivals were celebrated by the Levis, this was done less to worship God than to gather relatives for food and entertainment, which reminds me of something that Dr. Isabel said yesterday about let's eat. More than once, Levi characterizes his family as 95% Italian and 5% Jewish. So that gives you some sense of how he sees himself as a young man. Levi is a very bright student at school. He is often teased by his classmates. He tells us that usually he was teased for reasons other than being Jewish, but sometimes he was teased for being Jewish. He says, looking back, as a Jew, I'd been made fun of by my schoolmates. Not beaten up, but made fun of, yes. So that's a memory of his childhood. He has his bar mitzvah at the traditional age of 13 in 1932. He prepares for his bar mitzvah for 2 years at Hebrew school. Around this time, and he likes to point out for a very brief period of time, he professed that he believed in God and that he vowed to be an observant Jew. So when he was 13, he professed to believe in God. Years later, looking back on his 13-year-old self, he attributes this brief boyhood religiosity to his grandparents promising him a bicycle. And his biographer Thompson writes, once Levi had obtained the bicycle, he became indifferent to God. And I say here, as we'll see, Levi will remain, if not indifferent to God, at least a non-believer in God for the rest of his life. So in 1938, when Levi is a 19-year-old university student, fascist Italy enacts its race laws. Italy is trying to impress Hitler and Nazi Germany, so Italy adopts its own race laws in 1938 when Levi is 19 years old. Among other restrictions, Jews are forbidden to marry Aryans and are banned from teaching at and attending public schools and universities, and Levi is a university student. Fortunately, Jews in their second year of university and beyond, as Levi was, were able to stay and complete their studies. So at age 22, Levi gets his degree in chemistry. And it's worth noting that the phrase of Jewish race is stamped right onto his diploma from the University of Turin. Okay, in 1943, the Allies invade Italy. And at first, this looks like good news. Mussolini is deposed. Italy surrenders to the Allies. But in very short order, German troops occupy northern Italy. They reinstate Mussolini to be the leader of this puppet state in northern Germany, and that's where Levi and his friends and his family are in Turin. So in December 1943, Levi and several friends leave Turin in search of anti-fascist partisans in the mountains north of the city. And this little band of young men and women have very little experience and very little equipment, and they are promptly arrested by fascist militia, Italian militia in northwest Italy. Levi makes it clear, this is interesting, Levi makes it clear that the reason he told the militiamen who arrested him that he was Jewish rather than an anti-fascist in search of resistance fighters in the mountains had nothing to do with his religious faith or a strong self-conception as a Jew. He writes, during the interrogation, I preferred to admit my status as Italian citizen of Jewish race. I felt that otherwise I would be unable to justify my presence in places too secluded even for an evacuee. And I believed, wrongly as it was subsequently seen, that the admission of my political activity would have meant torture and certain death. Elsewhere, Levi says that the militiamen who arrested him in the mountains told him, if you're part of the resistance, we'll line you up against the wall and we'll shoot you. If you are a Jew, we'll send you to a camp in Italy. So that's why Levi says, I'm a Jew, not a resistance fighter. Initially, he is brought to an Italian prison camp where prisoners are treated comparatively well, but unfortunately, Germans soon take over the administration of the camp. And in February 1944, Primo Levi is one of 650 Jews taken by train to Auschwitz in Poland. So I'm now going to talk about Levi's time at Auschwitz. So he arrives in February 1944. He makes a point in the first few pages of survival in Auschwitz that he was very thirsty on arrival. They told him, you can't drink from the taps. So in the first few pages, in his first hours at the camp, he reaches for an icicle to quench his thirst. And as he's grabbing the icicle, he says a big gloved hand knocks it out of his hand. Why? Asks the naive new arrival, Levi. And the reply is, here there is no why. As the large guard pushed him back inside. So that's his first lesson at Auschwitz. Here there is no why. And if you've read Survival in Auschwitz, you'll know that Levi often quotes from Dantes Inferno. And here's the first quote in his first hours at the camp from Dantes Inferno. As he does so often, Levi quotes Dantes Inferno in a bid to communicate something of the hellish degradation that was Auschwitz. And this is a quote from Dantes Inferno. No sacred face will help you here. This is not a bathing party. So he's referring to a passage in Canto 21 of Dante's Inferno where a new arrival in hell is being taunted by demons, saying, no God is going to help you here. This is not a swimming party. So that's the first reference to the divine in Survival in Auschwitz. And in a sense, this notion of here, there is no why. At Auschwitz, there is no why is the first or one of the first lessons Levi learns. And I think this is perhaps the most important lessons that he learns. That if one is to survive in the camp, it is better to focus one's energies on immediate day-to-day necessities, food, clothing, work details, making alliances with other prisoners, etc., than spending time on ultimate questions. Why the Jews? Why murder? Why does God permit this to happen? So Levi learns to focus on the immediate demands his attention, and he says, he learns there's no time for ultimate questions. Why God, where's God? Why the Jews, etc. He writes, the act of not trying to understand was the first wise dictum one had to learn in the camp. To try and understand there on the spot was a futile effort, a waste of energy that would have been more useful to invest in the daily struggle against hunger and fatigue. So Levi learns not to try and understand, not to be troubled by these ultimate questions. Later, Levi notes that he rarely had time to think about death while he was a prisoner at Auschwitz. He says, "I almost never had time to devote to death. I had many other things to keep me busy, finding a bit of bread, avoiding exhausting work, patching my shoes, stealing a broom, etc." So that's what he says about death. And I think the same thing can be said about the topic of God. I don't think Levi has much time at Auschwitz to think about the topic of God. He's focused on clothing, food, etc. Okay, so because the 26-year-old Levi has so little time to think about ultimate matters, his book that he wrote immediately upon his release from Auschwitz, it doesn't spend a lot of time on these ultimate matters of God and faith and suffering, etc. As we'll see in a minute, 40 years later in The Drowned and the Saved, he does have the time to consider these ultimate questions about God's presence or God's absence. But when he's there as a 26-year-old, he's too busy focused on more immediate concerns. But before we turn to the later Levi, there is one passage in Survival in Auschwitz where he does talk about God and faith and Holocaust suffering. This is in chapter 13 of Survival in Auschwitz, and this is one of the most frightening episodes in the book. He describes a so-called selection that the SS were conducting among prisoners. Each prisoner in Levi's barrack is handed an index card containing his number, his name, profession, age, and nationality. The prisoners are made to strip naked and run past several SS men who rapidly assign each man's index card to one of two piles. One pile of cards represents those prisoners deemed suitable for further labor. Oh, I didn't mention, Levi is in the labor camp portion of Auschwitz. The other pile of index cards represent those men who are condemned to die. Levi writes, "In 3 or 4 minutes, a hut of 200 men is done." Dozens of men in Levi's barracks are sentenced to death. And cruelly, the doomed men remain in the barrack for 2 or 3 days after their sentence until arrangements can be made to send them to the gas. So the men condemned to die are still in the barrack with their comrades who are not condemned to die for 2 days. Levi writes, "Silence about this post-selection experience in the barrack, where some of them are condemned to die and some are not." Levi writes, "Silence slowly prevails, and then from my bunk on the top row, I see and hear old Kuhn, K-U-H-N, Kuhn, praying aloud with his beret on his head, swaying backward and forward violently. Kuhn is thanking God because he has not been chosen." The typically unflappable Levi grows angry with Kuhn and his prayers, and this is quoting Levi about Kuhn and his prayers. "Does he not see Beppo, the Greek, in the bunk next to him? Beppo, who is 20 years old and is going to the gas chambers the day after tomorrow and knows it and lies there looking fixedly at the light without saying anything and without even thinking anymore? Can Kun fail to realize that next time it will be his turn? Does Kun not understand what has happened today is an abomination which no propitiatory prayer, no pardon, no expiation, which nothing at all in the power of man can ever clean again? And then I write, chapter 13 ends with one of the book's most provocative and uncharacteristically judgmental remarks. Levi writes, if I was God, I would spit in Kun's face. And if you've read Survival in Auschwitz, you know that Primo Levi is very calm, very detached. He's observing things in a dispassionate, clinical manner. And the fact that he gets so angry with the story of Kun and his prayers is quite remarkable in this book. Okay, because Survival in Auschwitz is a best-selling book, this story of Kun and his prayers is very well known, and I've discussed it with my students. What is not so well known is that 40 years later, in The Drowned and the Saved, Levi returns to that same selection story, and the 40-year later version is even more personal. So this is what he is writing in the 1980s, near the end of his career. And he's talking about the temptation to pray during this selection process. Levi writes, I must admit that I experienced, and only once, the temptation to yield, to seek refuge in prayer. This happened in October 1944, in the moment I lucidly perceived the imminence of death. When naked and compressed among my naked companions, with my personal index card in hand, I was waiting to file past the commission that with one glance would decide whether I would go immediately to the gas chamber or was instead strong enough to go on working. For one instant, I felt the need to ask for help and asylum. Then, despite my anguish, equanimity prevailed. So he regains his composure. And I like this line. One does not change the rules of the game at the end of the match, not when you are losing. And he goes on to say, a prayer under these circumstances would have been not only absurd, but blasphemous, obscene, laden with the greatest impiety of which a non-believer is capable. I rejected that temptation. I knew that otherwise, were I to survive, I would have to be ashamed of it. So again, his treatment of this selection story from the 1980s is not nearly as well known or nearly as well studied as the one from the 1940s. And I find this idea of the greatest impiety of which a non-believer is capable. And had he prayed, it would have been a blasphemous act. I find that a fascinating idea coming from this lifelong non-believer. Had he prayed that day, Levi, the long-standing non-believer, would be guilty of the greatest impiety of which a non-believer is capable. Interestingly, this is not the only time that the later Levi levels the charge of blasphemy with respect to God and Auschwitz. There's another section in the later Levi, in The Drowned and the Saved, where he also appeals to this notion of blasphemy. He says that he was, shortly after his release from Auschwitz, he was visited by a friend. He writes, after my return from imprisonment, I was visited by a friend, older than myself. He was glad to find me alive and basically unhurt. He told me that my having survived could not be the work of chance, of an accumulation of fortunate circumstances, but rather of providence. I bore the mark. I was an elect. I, the non-believer, and even less of a believer after Auschwitz, was a person touched by grace, a saved man. Levi goes on to say, why me? Why me? It is impossible to know, his friend answered, perhaps because perhaps because I had to write, and by writing, bear witness. Wasn't I, in fact, in 1946, writing a book about my imprisonment? So that's the incident with the friend who says he was saved by God. Levi says, such an opinion seemed monstrous to me. It pained me, as when one touches an exposed nerve, and kindled the doubt I spoke of before. I might be alive in the place of another, at the expense of another. He goes on to say, at Auschwitz, the worst survived. The selfish, the violent, the insensitive, the collaborators of the gray zone, the spies. The worst survived. The best all died. So he finds this idea that God spared him and that he was somehow an elect. He says this does not reconcile with his time at Auschwitz. He retells this story in an interview, and he uses the word blasphemy about this notion that God has spared Levi. He uses the word blasphemy yet again. So if Levi does not attribute his survival to divine help, the help of providence, what does he attribute his survival to? Remarkably, the very first few words of survival in Auschwitz